Hello, I'm Michael. There's a saying in the New Testament of which I'm very fond. It comes from the letter of James. Faith without action is useless. Very strong statement, that. Faith without action is useless. I think we can discover what people really believe, what their faith is, by what they do rather than what they say. And certainly we Quakers think that. We don't have a formal creed, a statement of beliefs. And we say that people can discover what we believe by what we do. For me, faith isn't about believing a set of propositions, a set of ideas. It's about trying to be open to God, open to the leadings of God, to be responsive to what God wants us to do. That sounds as though I believe that God is a sort of person. I don't think that about God. I see God very much as a creative power in the universe, a creative power working for good in all things. And I think what we need to do as individual people is to try to align ourselves with that activity of God, with that creative power. And that when we do that, we find that things come along for us to do, opportunities present themselves, doors begin to open, and we can go through those doors in faith, trusting that it's the right thing to do. So what happens if we get a sense that we ought to do something, a leading from God, a nudge from God? How do we discern whether that's right? The problem is there are so many things that we could do, so many good things that we could give our time to. How do we know whether we should respond to these particular things that come along? I think what we have to do is to try and work out what's right for us as individual people, what's right for me. Doing something where I can use my abilities, my talents to best effect, something that I ought to do. I'm reminded by one of our sayings in Advices and Queries, this little book that we use so often, is that what we're required to do is to do what love requires of us, which may not be the same as great busyness. And if we're not careful as Quakers, we can get tied up in so many things that we're not particularly effective. So it's a matter of discernment, deciding, selecting what we ought to do. So how do we do that? Well, there are times, certainly this is my experience, there are times when something comes along, we get a feeling that we ought to do something, we investigate it, and it's absolutely clear that that's something that's right for us, something we ought to do. There's no question about it at all. And it's equally true that sometimes an idea is presented to us, a suggestion is made to us, sometimes from Quaker nominations committees who are seeking people to do jobs. And it's been clear to me then that that wasn't the time to do that. It wasn't right for me to do that. More common, though, than certainty is a lack of clearness about what I should do. If it's suggested to me or I get an idea about doing something, I'm not entirely clear whether it's the right thing for me to do. Is this really something from God? Is it really a nudge or a prompt from God to do this? Is my hesitation a lack of faith in God or a warning that it's something I shouldn't do? Am I being encouraged to do this particular thing by unworthy motives about which I'm ignorant? There's that element of uncertainty about it. If I find myself in this position of uncertainty as to whether I should do something or not, whether it really is an act of faith to do it, I find various things are helpful to me. One test that I use is to see whether what I feel I'm being led to do squares with our Quaker Testimonies, our testimonies to truth and equality, to simplicity, to peace. If what I'm being encouraged to do responds to one or more of those testimonies, then that might well be a sign that it's right. Another thing that's very helpful in trying to make up my mind as to whether to do something is support and encouragement from the Quaker community. Talking to other Quakers about what I feel I perhaps ought to do can be very helpful, as can reading Quaker literature, particularly our book Quaker Faith and Practice. That can help me sort my ideas out and to decide whether something that I ought to do is the right thing for me to do. But if at the end of this process of discernment, the end of this trying to sort out my ideas, if I accept that what I'm being to do really is a leading from God, and I respond in faith, my experience is that what I do will be blessed and will lead for me to personal fulfillment.
Faith and action actually came together for me. At the time when I came to Quakers, which is about 14 years ago, at the time when I found my faith, or rather it found me, because that's how it felt, I was in an uncomfortable place at work too. I'd worked in publishing most of my life and was at the time an independent literary agent. I had my own business for about 14 years. But increasingly I'd become uncomfortable with the world that it was, which was very much about celebrity, very much about the bottom line, and it was no longer a place that I felt fitted who I was. And when I came to Quakers, I realised I just had to stop. I just had to stop doing what I was doing. I had no idea what I was going to do, but it was very clear that I had to stop. And so I sold my business. And it isn't so important what I went on to do. What was important was the process. Arguably, the biggest spiritual moment of my life was the fact that I didn't know what I was going to do, and it didn't matter. Because all my life I'd been quite ambitious. I thought, well, I'll do this and then that, and I'd always got an eye to the CV. This will lead to that, and that will be useful for that. And I let go of all that. I let go of the need to control. And the freedom it gave me was absolutely astonishing. And I thought, why has it taken me all my life to this point to understand that's the way to lead my life? I just trusted that I would be shown, and indeed I was, and have gone on to be shown. And that has been the way that my life has been from then on. And when I came to Quakers, firstly, I found a different concept of what religion was, a different way of leading my life, that it was about integrity, that it was about being true to who I was. And that's not an easy thing. It's no easy option when you have nobody telling you what to do and no preset prayers and so on, but there is just you and God and the other people in the room, very importantly, that community. And that community, I found, was hugely enabling. I'd been a very idealistic child, and I remember hearing about starvation in Africa and so on, and saying, but why can't we just put tins of food on ships and send them over there? And people would say, yes, they're there, dear, and pat me on the head. And I got the sense that one couldn't make a difference, and all my life I had thought one couldn't make a difference. The injustice and the poverty was just too great. But here I was coming across people who were making a difference in small local ways. But everybody was in some way making a difference. And that was so empowering, because I suddenly realized maybe I could too. And so I started being led into all sorts of avenues. I mean, before that, I had never campaigned, I'd never marched, I'd never volunteered, and now that has become a major part of my life. So my life has completely changed. So what is it about Quakers that makes it such an enabling community? I think it's partly a belief in the dynamic spirit, because what happens in the meeting for worship is not just about a connection with God that is comfortable in your chair then and there. It is about moving you out into the world. And I think it's because Quakers take responsibility, because we don't have a separate priesthood. We have to take responsibility for our faith, for our organisation, and that leads us, I believe, to take responsibility for what's going on in the world, to try and mend it. And so I have come to understand that working in the world comes from a quite different place from where I thought it came from. It comes from an equal place. It's come from a sense that there is no other.
For most of my life, I've been involved in doing things for religious organisations, first as an Anglican and then latterly within the Quaker movement. But particularly in the last 8 years, I've found the space, since I retired early from teaching, I've found the space to do work for the Quakers, for the Religious Society of Friends, and also to try and do work in the community. I found that when I retired, I looked round for things to do, and people said, don't rush into things, take your time. People will want you to do all sorts of things. But inevitably, I found that things started to come along. People started to make suggestions, or I became aware of possibilities of how I could fill my time. One of the things that came along first, which really surprised me, was a request from our local Quaker group to be a governor in a Quaker-founded special school. This came quite out of the blue. I'd not really thought about doing this before. Although I'd been a teacher for most of my working life, my teaching had been with mainstream boys and girls in an 11 to 18 high school. I knew very little about special schools. But I felt it was right to investigate it, and I went along to find out about what it would involve. And it became very clear to me as soon as I got into the school and met people who were working there that this was something that I ought to do, that it would be right for me to follow this through. And for the last 4 years I've been the chair of governors of this school and become very involved in its activities, and have found that this is most rewarding. I'm quite clear that responding to the invitation to be a governor at this school was a response to the leadings of God. Another thing that came along fairly early on was a response to an advert in the local paper. A new youth offending team had been set up in Runcorn and Warrington, and they were looking for volunteers to work with young offenders. And as soon as I read this, it seemed to me that this was something that I might do. While I was a teacher for about 17 of the years that I taught, I was a pastoral year tutor and had spent a lot of time working with young people, helping them to sort out their problems, working with their parents and things like that. And so it seemed that it might well be something that I could make a contribution towards. I investigated it and was taken on as a volunteer. I was rather apprehensive about doing this work. I'd not had any dealings with young offenders. Would I be able to communicate with them and with their families? I was concerned about the strong emotions that might surround young offenders and the things that they'd done. Would I be able to cope with that? Would I have the wisdom to help young people sort themselves out and help them to become responsible members of the community? Well, I acted in faith. It seemed the right thing to do. And I found, as so many people have found in the past, that when you're given a task to do, when it's something that you ought to do, that along with that task comes the ability, the wherewithal to do it properly and to do it well. And I've found great fulfilment in doing that kind of work. As well as things like that, inevitably when you retire early, the Quaker community finds you things to do. We're always short of volunteers to do all the jobs that needs to be done. At first I was asked to be area meeting clerk, which I did for 4 years, and found that a great joy, even though it was quite demanding at times. And now I'm area meeting treasurer, which again I quite enjoy apart from when I've got to do the accounts. But it's right to use my abilities and gifts in the service of the Quaker community. One thing again that I've learnt since I retired is that sometimes you're led to do things, if you're faithful and try to align yourself with the activity of God, you're led to do things which are not particularly congenial to you, things that you wouldn't have chosen for yourself. For me, it's working on my local meeting's property committee. I hate that sort of work. I'm really not interested in trees and drains and the fact that last week someone pinched our ornamental gate that leads into the meeting house, and I've got to sort that out with the local police and things like that. And yet being led to do that kind of work was right. I've got abilities that can be used by that committee, and I've got the time to do certain things. And I've learnt from that it would be immature, it would be childish to expect that we're only led to do things that are congenial, things that will give us immediate pleasure or satisfaction. We have to do what we're led to do. A phrase that I've carried from my Anglican days into my Quaker faith is a phrase from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. And it describes God as the one whom to serve is perfect freedom. I like that phrase, whom to serve is perfect freedom. And I've found it's true in practice that if we are faithful, if we are responsive to the leadings of God, that we're given tasks to do that can be really useful in the community, in our religious group, and useful to ourselves. It enables us to be the kind of people that we're supposed to be, free to be ourselves.
So where has my faith taken me in terms of what I do in the world? Taken me to some very strange places that I couldn't have imagined that I'd be in. If I look back 20 years, I could never have imagined that I'd be doing the things that I'm doing. So very unexpected. When I let go of my business and had no idea what I was going to do, what happened was a phone call. And I had let it be known that I would do a bit of volunteering. I thought, a few hours a week while I thought what to do. But I got a call from a Quaker charity saying, we've been offered a big church in the East End of London to turn into a community centre. Would you like to do it? Well, I'd never run a community centre. I didn't know what one was really. I didn't know anything about the East End. All I knew was sort of how to organise things, and I said yes. A huge leap of faith in the person that rang me to imagine that I might be able to do such a thing. Anyway, steep learning curve. Enormous fun. Absolutely loved it. And after a while, it became apparent that some kind of financial intervention was going to be necessary because the people I was working with were very poor. A lot of women from Bangladesh, huge overcrowding, huge unemployment, great disempowerment. And I remembered reading about something called the Grameen Bank, which was the beginning of microcredit in Bangladesh. And I'd been so impressed by it, although I'd never imagined I'd get involved with it, that I'd cut out the piece. And amazingly, it was 10 years before I found the piece. And I started looking into microcredit and exploring it in various countries. And I fortunately got a Churchill Fellowship and went to Bangladesh and Poland and France and looked at different models. And came back and started a microcredit program in London. Although it's an ugly word and it sounds as if it's all about money, actually it's about trust and about community. And it's about empowering individuals to give them a tiny bit of money to allow them to start their own business, mostly working with women. And how beautiful that it should be one of the poorest countries of the world that gave it to us. So I ran that program in London, working with 22 nationalities for the first year, for a few years, then went travelling for a while, and recently have been asked to do it in various countries around the world. And so I have been to Madagascar and South Africa and Ghana to train local people, crucially that, to run these programs. And it is so beautiful. I so love it. I love the process. I love the signs of hope in somebody's eyes when you say, but yes, that's a wonderful idea. Of course you can do it. And I realise I'm using old skills actually, because as a literary agent, it was important to elicit what somebody had to offer. And that's exactly what one does with microcredit, is to elicit the skill that is in every person. That of God in every person, that talent that every person has. There isn't anybody in the world who doesn't have it. And microcredit is an assertion of that. And when I was a literary agent, I used to think, oh, I wish I was a doctor. I wish I had a transferable skill. Who on earth wants a literary agent? What use can I be in the world? And now I have one. Now I have been given something that I can take to other parts of the world. And that is deeply precious to me. And there's a phrase, and I'm not sure where it comes from, different people have given it to different, have suggested other people who've given it, which is where my deep joy meets the deep hunger of the world. I think everybody has a group of people to whom they're most drawn. Anyone who does any kind of action in the world, it may be that they're drawn to their local community. It may be they're drawn to people with mental health issues or children or the elderly. I seem to be drawn to people who are destitute, people on the edges of society. And I find it's crucial to me to keep going back to developing countries, to have an injection of what they offer, because this is not about do-goodery. This is about relationship. This is about my learning from them. What I see are not people who are destitute. I see people who have huge self-respect, enormous reserves, and great joy in the way that they live with nothing. And I need reminding about what matters. I need reminding that it is possible to live with nothing and be joyful.